A disclaimer. I am not a doctor or other medical professional, and although I have found my experiences generally do match up with other people I've met who've gone off testosterone, not everybody reacts in exactly the same way, and so you should take this as my personal experiences going off hormones and nothing else. A lot of trans people do go off of testosterone replacement therapy, but it does result in a lot of physical, mental, and emotional changes and shouldn't be undertaken without consulting your prescribing doctor. A lot of trans men and other folks who go on testosterone replacement therapy will wind up going off of it at some point. Some people choose to go off of it forever, some people are forced off of it temporarily by financial problems, other people need to go off of it for medical reasons, and yes, some people do fully detransition into their assigned sex. In my case, I had a variety of reasons I went off of TRT, but I'll talk about those in other episodes. In this episode, I just want to focus on what happened while I was off of HRT. Like, what was it like? I went off of testosterone borderline cold turkey. I intended to give myself a half dose until my bottle of testosterone was gone, but I pretty much just said fuck it after the first half dose I attempted and just stopped taking it. Just as an important aside, I didn't get any guidance from my doctor on how to do this. I tried to, but by the end of my first stint on hormones, my endocrinologist was really hard for me to get in contact with, and she didn't get back to me. So I didn't take my own advice to talk to a doctor first, but I want to point out I did try to take that advice. It is well known among competent hormone providers that a lot of people do go off of testosterone. And so they should be perfectly receptive to helping you do that safely if you just bring it up with them. Another thing I want to say, I've talked to a lot of people about their hormone plans who wanted my insight, people who are considering things like temporary testosterone, or people who are on TRT and strongly considered going off of it. And one thing I think is really important in retrospect is this. If you do go off of it, be open to going back on it. A lot of people do great going off of testosterone, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be among those people. It is okay to decide after a couple weeks, a couple months, or even like a few years or longer off of testosterone that being off of it actually isn't for you. And I, on a personal level, wound up struggling for a lot longer than I had to because I had sort of shelved the possibility of going back on hormones, and I greatly suggest that you don't fall into the same position I did. Anyway, all of that said, here's the list of basic things that happened upon going off of HRT. The very first effects. So the first effect of going off of HRT was just an enormous sense of relief and well-being. The thought of potentially never having to give myself another intramuscular injection was just an overwhelmingly calming sensation for me. That first few weeks, I didn't feel any physical effects at all, and emotionally I very often got like an intense sense of euphoria thinking about how my transition was finally over and I could just exist as a man without dealing with medicalizing it. And that feeling obviously didn't last forever for me, and I eventually was looking into medical procedures I never thought I needed when I started transitioning. But at the time, I'll be honest, that honeymoon period was fantastic, and I'm really happy for people who successfully go off of T forever with that same ongoing success. As my ovaries started to kick in again, the main thing I experienced was hot flashes, or at least what I interpreted to be hot flashes. I don't really understand this, I'll admit that right now. I haven't heard of, for instance, transgender women getting hot flashes going on estrogen. Usually I think that's associated with a drop in estrogen rather than an increase, but whatever the case, the first physical effect that I experienced was something that I interpreted as a hot flash, or that felt like a hot flash, which happened shortly before I started menstruating again. Menstruation. One day, over a month after stopping hormones, I was driving home from work and I felt a very familiar telltale feeling. So I stopped at Arby's to use the restroom, and sure enough, I was bleeding again. I excitedly told my girlfriend, who told me she'd never met anybody who was that excited to get the blood. A lot of trans men get particularly dysphoric about menstruation, which is just something that I've never personally experienced. I generally considered getting a menstrual period to be a pain in the ass at worst, and before I started TRT, I was really bad at managing it until I got a menstrual cup early in college. But it never gave me dysphoria. It was just a thing that happened, and so when that cranked back up again, it was actually kind of fun and even a little validating to be able to experiment with different menstruation management methods just because I'd been so bad at that before I went on hormones. During those 3 years off of HRT, I did a lot of experiments with menstrual cups and period underwear and cloth pads, and if it weren't for the fact that so many of those products don't exist anymore, they're like casualties of the COVID pandemic, I'd probably repost those videos. I actually really liked reviewing menstrual products and like would not mind doing it again, but it's just not relevant to my life anymore. But that's really all I have to say in this section. There was no real change in menstruation before going on hormones and after going on hormones. It was just the same thing. Hair and skin. Hair was a really interesting change. The first thing to realize is that most people don't lose all of their facial hair when they go off of hormones, and in fact you might not lose any of it. I went off of hormones around the time I started growing my beard and mustache, and yes, they were weaker than they are now, but they were decent. My mustache and beard did have a lot of white and blonde terminal hairs in them. I'd convinced myself that it was just because I was getting older and naturally starting to get some gray on the face, but now that I am back on testosterone, I can say pretty confidently that the amount of gray was a side effect of being off of HRT. I dealt with that by dyeing it, and I do still dye it, even though it's nowhere near as gray as it was back then. My facial hair didn't grow as long as it does now, or as fast, but it definitely got long enough to be visible, and help me be read as male consistently, and it continued to fill in on the more patchy areas of my face. So for instance, my mustache has been very gradually connecting with my beard, like in this area here, and my beard has gradually been crawling up my cheeks, and that progress never really stopped when I was off of HRT. It was slower, but I was still growing new terminal hairs there, and I'm not entirely sure why. It might just be a genetic thing because women in my family tend to grow terminal hair on their faces as they get older, but the point is that yes, my facial hair was really stunted. I'll throw a picture up, yes, right here, to show what it looked like when I was off of hormones. But I definitely still had it, and it was decent for what it was. My skin was really nice. I didn't have a lot of acne, but the acne I did have pretty much went away when I was off of hormones. And during the first 2 years, I was kind of enamored with how soft my skin got. My body hair didn't go away at all either, although like my facial hair, it did get a little bit softer. I grew long hair while I was off of hormones, and my hairline stopped receding, but I didn't grow any hair back, and I still have a big, like, bald spot on my vertex. It's not like, I'll show you, like, it's not massively bad. I don't know if you can even see that, but it's something that happened when I went off of hormones the first time, and it's just like something that never resolved itself off of hormones. I didn't expect it to, but it's just worth mentioning that it did nothing for that. Body and face shape. This is really where the most dramatic changes off of testosterone came in, and eventually this is one of the two main issues that eventually caused me to go back on it. It's hard really to explain how my face shape changed, except to say that it got dramatically more feminine. And this was really appealing for a while because I was going through a thing where I couldn't get enough of being androgynous. But as soon as that desire for androgyny subsided and I started feeling very masculine again, it was probably the second hardest part of being off of hormones. I would look in the mirror and just immediately my gaze would zero in on every feminine aspect of my face. The level of facial dysphoria, it was actually a lot worse off of HRT than it was before going on HRT, which is actually a convenient illustration of a huge misconception I'd had about hormones before I went off of them. I had it in my head that all I really needed was to pass, and I never really stopped passing when I was off T. Before testosterone, I didn't pass, but I didn't feel like a sense of crushing dysphoria just from the shape of my face. And then after going off of testosterone for a while, that face shape got really unsettling, even though other people didn't even really seem to notice that much. Although all of this was very obvious and visible to me, it didn't cause people to read me as a woman, at least not from the front. I'm sure that other trans people were probably more apt to read me as trans while I was off of HRT because of those face shape changes, but I have no real evidence to suggest that most cis people read me as trans or noticed anything going on at all. I could tell you stories of times that cis men in particular made commentary that made it very clear that they thought I was also cis, and doctors were always really surprised when I told them that I wasn't on hormones anymore, or even that I was trans to begin with. Like, people just didn't notice. With friends especially, my commentary about how my face was changing was met with counter-commentary that I didn't look any different. When I was really into how I looked, I'd say something like, wow, my eyes just have become so beautiful, and they'd remark that they looked exactly the same to them. 2 years later, I'd say, oh my god, my jawline has gotten so feminine and I'm suddenly very self-conscious about it. And they'd remark again that I looked exactly the same to them. I didn't look exactly the same. My photos showing how I looked right before I went back on HRT, as well as my passport and ID photos, are a huge testament to that. But the point is, the only people who seemed to actually notice, or at least who admitted they noticed, were myself and the small minority of trans people who knew I was off of hormones and were trying to shame me for it, which I'll talk about a bit later. My body shape also changed quite a bit, although not in a way that it was as uncomfortable as my face was, just because my figure was not particularly feminine to begin with. I never really had super feminine hips, and my chest was small enough to just pass for a fat cis man chest. So, although I did start getting really dysphoric about my chest at some point, and I did get top surgery while I was off hormones, I didn't really notice changes in my chest while I was off of HRT. Muscle and strength. My muscle strength dramatically decreased after a while, and while it wasn't one of the two big priority things that made me go back on HRT, it was a strong contender for third place. It was one of those things that was kind of weird because I didn't actually notice when I went on HRT the first time that it had made me physically stronger. I noticed I was getting more muscle, and I especially noticed stuff like forearm and hand veins that I really liked, but actual strength was not something that I really paid attention to or noticed. I only noticed those muscle strength changes when I lost them going off of HRT. There was one point where my girlfriend and I were playfully wrestling and she pinned me, and I could not for the life of me get out of that pin, and I was really trying. I couldn't best this woman in a basic feat of strength no matter what I did, even though I had sworn I'd been able to pin her before. Because I hadn't noticed being off of HRT made me physically weaker, my immediate assumption was that she had let me win in earlier times, and I was like really offended because I wasn't upset about having a girlfriend who was physically stronger than me, but one who was both physically stronger than me and who pretends to be weaker than me was something that I found just really offensive. When I asked her about this later, she explained that I actually had been physically stronger when I was on HRT, and I have no reason to believe that she would make that up, because you once were strong but now you are weak would be a very weird thing to make up. To be clear, I didn't do practically any strength training while I was off HRT. I might have been able to maintain some of that muscle strength if I had, but there's no way for me to know because I didn't do that. Medical conditions. After going on HRT, I acquired two chronic medical conditions. The first was secondary polycythemia, which is an overproduction of red blood cells. I started donating blood while I was on HRT in order to manage that condition. And I continued to donate blood periodically while I was off of HRT just because I liked doing it. But during the periods of time when I didn't donate blood, my red blood cell counts did go back to normal, and that was pretty much directly a result of the testosterone. The second condition was hypertension. And folks, I was really, really hoping that my hypertension would be resolved by going off of HRT. as I had thought that going on HRT was what caused it. It turns out that my hypertension is actually a combination of obesity and heredity. So not only did going off HRT not resolve the hypertension, I actually had to increase my dose of beta blockers while I was off of HRT. So it turns out I was blaming the testosterone for something that probably was going to happen anyway. Emotions. An interesting thing about hormones and emotions is that, yes, hormones do affect your emotions, but when you go on HRT, you also have an expectation that your emotions are going to change. So it's often unclear whether or not the emotional changes you experience are actually due to the hormones or if it's due to your expectations because you know that you're on hormones. I've come to the conclusion that, at least for me, this is about half and half. A lot of trans men, including myself, find that we're less able to cry after going on HRT. And when going on testosterone, I did find out that I cried a lot less. I still cried during movies and like emotional moments like that, which is a trait that I share with the cis men in my family, but I no longer cried when I was angry or frustrated, and only rarely when I was actually sad. The thing is, though, that this largely didn't change when I went off of HRT. I didn't start crying more when I went off HRT in most circumstances, even though I fully expected to be able to. The deal with this is that the consequences of crying as an adult are really, really socially determined. And although they're socially determined, they're determined in a way that feels natural and biological. I'm not going to get into a whole diatribe about who gets to cry as an adult, but people who are more likely to get their way when they cry do so more often. Crying doesn't get your way that often when you are an adult man, but it does when you are an adult woman, specifically a white adult woman. So although I was able to cry more in a few contexts, I never relearned the strategic tears, and, you know, thank God for that, because that's actually like a really terrible thing that white women tend to do, that it makes me feel really gross in retrospect that I did do that when I was still red as one. As far as dysphoria, I wasn't dysphoric for quite a lengthy period of time after I went off of hormone replacement therapy, and it took about 2 years for it to come crashing back, spurred on mostly by those face changes I talked about, as well as sex drive changes, which I'll talk about a bit at the end of this video. Social and community issues. This isn't an inherent effect of going off of HRT, but it's something that is really important to mention. Going public about being off of HRT got some really weirdly mixed responses. Most people were positive. I had a lot of people in trans forums, and even one person in person who recognized me from YouTube who just loved my channel. And because going off of HRT is not uncommon, there were a lot of people who really valued that input. Every once in a while, though, I would encounter someone who had just a total stick up his ass about it, and those times felt really, really awful. Not that I wouldn't have noticed anyway, but there were some trans medicalist assholes who just loved coming out of the woodwork to inform me of every feminine trait that I had developed off of hormones, and they would insist that everybody around me could tell that I was off of hormones. And realistically, I knew that they only thought that they could tell I was off of HRT because I already told them I was off of HRT, but meeting people who have decided they should dedicate a great deal of time to making you feel insecure really became a problem after a while. This had effects that went beyond me, too. One time in particular, there were 2 trans guys in a forum who were just relentlessly attacking me for having gone off of hormones, and although they got kicked out of that group because the admins didn't share their shitty attitudes, in the meanwhile, people who were also off of hormones who hadn't talked about it were messaging me talking about how suddenly unsafe they realized they felt in those spaces. And yeah, that was fixed by the admins, but like, how many people left because they witnessed that? Like, that's a thing that that I still think about every once in a while. I'm not saying that how other people feel about you should necessarily be what decides this for you. It's just important to know that there are some extreme assholes out there. Sex drive and responsiveness. So for this section, I do respectfully request that if you are a family member or coworker, or really if you're a cis person in general, that you stop watching this video now. I obviously can't control who watches it, but in general I'd really only prefer other trans people to see it, so for your convenience, this is also the last section. Although it does talk about some private things, I do think it's really important for trans people going off of hormones to know about them, which is why I'm talking about it anyway. So my sex drive off of HRT was an absolute mess. It's up there with face changes as being the worst effect of going off of HRT, and ultimately this is what broke me and caused me to go back on it. If it weren't for the bullying, I probably could have gone a bit longer off of testosterone as far as the face changes went, but it was just not something that I could handle, not having a sex drive. And that didn't start out bad. The thing about going on testosterone is that it has a tendency to really pump up your sex drive and make it weird. And that's something that can be really scary for a lot of trans people, and it was quite scary for me. Both trans men and cis men who are going through puberty go through periods of being just inappropriately horny, either at the wrong time, or directed at the wrong thing, or just you're unable to concentrate on anything other than sex. On HRT, I had a really hard time dealing with this that first time around, and so when I went off of HRT and my sex drive started tapering down, it was really welcome at the time. I felt like for the first time in 5 years, I had a normal sex drive. Because of this, in many respects, that first year off of hormones made sex a lot better than it was when I was on HRT the first time. I had some problems on HRT the first time with sensitivity that subsided when I was off testosterone, and my sex drive felt normal, like I already said. And at that time it was really freeing. What I hadn't counted on was that that effect wouldn't eventually level out. It just kept going down and just fully tanked. Before hormone replacement therapy, I had a decently high sex drive. Going on HRT, it got scary high, and then going off of it, it dwindled down to, I swear to God, practically nothing. Now, not everybody likes or desires sex, and that's fine, but there's a huge difference between being asexual and experiencing your sex drive abruptly tanking. It's hard to explain because mentally I had the desire to have sex, but I couldn't maintain the same level of motivation or arousal to do it, and that mismatch was a huge source of stress for me. I cannot overstate how miserable that part of being off of HRT was. And when my YouTube channel started going off the rails during those last couple months being off of T, when I was experimenting with stuff like a bunch of supplements that I didn't understand, it was because I was desperately trying to revive my sex drive. That is the only reason that that happened, was because of this side effect. Now, if you're really, really interested in going off of hormones and this section scares you, I do have something really important to add, which is that I have good reason to believe that this result is not typical. I learned from talking with my mom that she actually had a similar tanking of her sex drive, and I'm also aware that she used testosterone gel at some point because her sex drive was so low. I found doing a little cursory research that there's evidence suggesting that some aspects of your sex drive are hereditary, so I really believe that had I not gone on TRT to begin with, this is probably something that was going to happen anyway, and it seems to have happened around the same time in my life that it did in my mom's, so basically TRT masked a problem that I was going to experience anyway. So I wouldn't personally worry about that as long as you're open to going back on T if you do have trouble with it. Anyway, there are probably some minute details that I missed, but this is a pretty good general list of things that happened when I went off of hormone replacement therapy and things that you should watch out for or expect if you decide to go through that yourself. So until next time, happy trails.